David's here.
David's here.
Okay, good.
I've got my deck of cards.
Here.
I don't know if Johanna's here.
So, but I
Yep,
need,
we're ready.
so I need.
Is that better as far as the camera being up? Do you want us to speak?
Hello?
How are you? Oh, I think it's okay now. Yeah, let's not mess with that.
My head is all the way at the top of the frame, so if let me get a book.
Oh, dear. Didn't she want him to lower? So she prevented it.
Okay.
How's
Oh, I see.
how's my screen?
WCSU Election Connection presents the Connecticut 5th Congressional District Candidate Debate for the U.S. House of Representatives. Sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Northern Fairfield County, the League of Women Voters of Litchfield County, the News-Times, and Western Connecticut State University. Featuring Representative Johanna Hayes, David X. Sullivan, and Bruce Walzak. With Carol Reimers as moderator for the League of Women Voters of Connecticut. Brought to you by WCSU Election Connection. Monday, October 5th, 2020, 7 to 8:30 p.m. Streaming live at wcsu.edu/live and on YouTube at WCSU Election Connection.
Good evening. I'm Judith Greensman, President of the League of Women Voters of Northern Fairfield County. On behalf of the co-sponsors of this evening's debate, the League of Women Voters of Northern Fairfield County, the League of Women Voters of Litchfield County, Western Connecticut State University, and the News-Times, I want to welcome everyone watching. Thank yous are in order to so many who helped to make this broadcast possible. To Western Connecticut State University, which welcomed us on campus and was willing to serve as our virtual host. To Paul Steinmetz, Director of University and Community Relations. To Professor J.C. Barone and the technical wizards in the Election Connection team who are making this virtual debate a reality. To Professor J.C. Barone for his tireless oversight since we began planning for this debate many weeks ago. To those who submitted questions for the candidates, journalists Rob Reiser, representing the News-Times, and Bruno Matarazzo, representing the Republican American. Audrey Nielsen, News Director for Election Connection, and the voters in the 5th Congressional District. To Carrie Mayers, President of the League of Women Voters of Litchfield County, members of her chapter, and members of the League of Women Voters of Northern Fairfield County. Now, I would like to introduce Dr. John Clark, President of Western Connecticut State University.
I am Dr. John B. Clark, President of Western Connecticut State University. I welcome you to this most important debate among our 5th District congressional candidates. Representative Johanna Hayes, Republican David Sullivan, and Independent Bruce Walzak, which is being co-hosted by the League of Women Voters, the Danbury News-Times, and our university, and produced by our wonderful media arts students led by Professor J.C. Barone. Every year, our students produce a series of shows and projects for Election Connection, a program devoted to local, state, and national elections. I am very proud of these students and Professor Barone, who produce award-winning work that teaches them career skills even as they inform our communities about their election choices. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's time now for debate, and thank you very much.
Now, I want to introduce our moderator, Carol Reimers, President of the League of Women Voters of Connecticut. Thank you, Carol, for serving as our moderator this evening. Carol will introduce the candidates and review the debate format. The candidates have previously chosen by lot their order of speaking.
Thank you very much, Judy. It is my pleasure to be here with the 3 candidates who are running for the 5th Connecticut Congressional District seat in the United States House of Representatives. The candidates are Congresswoman Johanna Hayes, Democrat, David X. Sullivan, Republican, and Bruce Walzak, Independent. The candidates' order of speaking was determined before the debate. Each candidate will have up to 90 seconds to answer a question, and if desired, an additional 30 seconds for rebuttal. A second round of rebuttals of 30 seconds each may be offered by the moderator. Each candidate will have 2 minutes for a closing statement. So let's begin. Our first question begins with Mr. Walzak. He'll be followed by Ms. Hayes, and then Mr. Sullivan. Our first question comes from Rob Reiser of the News Times. Concerning the widespread protests and civil unrest across the country concerning police treatment of Black people in custody, do you believe the disparate treatment of people of color by police is a systematic problem that can be rectified by reform? What specific reform do you support? Mr. Walzak?
Thank you, Judy. And thank you to the League of Women Voters and, of course, WestCon and the students, professors, and staff there. My goal tonight is for you to learn a bit about me, how I approach issues, and how I'll conduct myself if elected. For me, it's important to point out that according to the American Debate League, the aim of a debate is to convince the opposition that you're right. I'm not here to do that tonight. There's no right or wrong and no winner or loser. There are ideas and possible solutions, and we need to focus on solutions and not ideology. Would you quickly repeat the question again, Carol?
Do you believe the disparate treatment of people of color by police is a systematic problem that can be rectified by reform? And what specific reform do you support?
I do unfortunately believe that the issues that we're facing today in terms of police behavior, racial and issues with diversity is systematic. It's built into our system, it's built into our natural responses, it's built into our laws, and there's simply no way to avoid that fact. Oh my goodness, that was quick.
Thank you very much. Okay, Ms. Hayes?
Thank you. And I don't want to waste my time, but thank everyone for having this debate and for being here to join us. I think what we've seen erupt in our country, the racial and social unrest that has bubbled over, is something that has long been brewing. So I know that we will have to face the systematic injustices in a critical way moving forward. I'm so proud of the people in this district who have had protests and rallies and are ready to have these very difficult conversations because, like it or not, some of these things are a part of the way the system is structured, and we have to work really hard to break those structures down. I think it can be reformed, though. One of the things that we've done at the federal level is to pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which calls for transparency, accountability, and reform. We have to rebuild the trust that is broken in our communities. And that can happen while also supporting law enforcement. It's not a binary choice. It's not one or the other. You can, being a person of color and trusting law enforcement and supporting them, are not in direct conflict with each other. And those are things that we can work on by hiring police officers that represent the communities, by training them, by putting grants in places to provide funding so that police can go out into the community and work with community, and by taking all of those things off the plate of police officers that they shouldn't have to deal with, like mental health services, addiction, and other things like that.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sullivan? I'm sorry, Mr. Sullivan, we cannot hear you.
There we go. My apologies. I'd like to thank the League of Women Voters for this opportunity. Having worked with law enforcement for 30 years here in the state of Connecticut, in the 5th District, state, local, and federal, I can tell you that we have very active community policing, that there have been many good things going on, and you don't see the rioting, you don't see the protests, you don't see the disparity here in Connecticut and in the 5th District. It's important to note that in Congress right now, the House has one bill, and Tim Scott in the Senate has another bill. Sadly, Congress can't arrive at a solution, and I want to work in a bipartisan manner with both Democrats and Republicans and the unaffiliated voters to have that conversation. You know, the state passed a bill a few weeks ago with no public hearings, with no input from law enforcement, whether it's chiefs associations or unions. We have to do a better job of having the discussion and having a peaceful discussion. So I look forward to doing that in Washington as your congressman.
Thank you. The next question is from Bruno Matarazzo of the Republican American newspaper. Since 1869, the U.S. Supreme Court has had 9 justices after legislation sponsored by Connecticut-born U.S. Senator Lyman Trumbull, a Republican from Illinois, was approved. Would you support legislation to add more justices to the Supreme Court if elected? And Ms. Hayes, you start first this time. I'm sorry, we cannot hear you, Ms. Hayes.
I was trying to get your attention because I thought after every question there was
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see. You have a rebuttal? Yeah, we can go back and you can rebut. Sorry about that, I didn't see it.
And what's the time for that?
30 seconds.
I just wanted to say that the House does have a bill, and the bill was done in consultation with police officers, chiefs around the country, law enforcement agencies. The bill that was passed at the state level is not a congressional bill. I am a congressional representative. I work at the federal level. I think that I trust state and local authorities to do the job of state and local authorities and pass state laws.
Okay, thank you. Did anyone else? Yes, Mr. Sullivan?
Well, I think it's also important to note that with the House bill, Nancy Pelosi did not seek any guidance, assistance, or counsel from her Republican counterparts, which has been a big problem in Washington and in the House of Representatives.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Walczak, did you have anything you would like to say?
I would. It's interesting tonight that everyone has a connection to the police department. I'm a former police commissioner. I support our police departments. I think the officers are carefully selected and well trained to do the job that we ask them to do. However, I do believe that the model of policing needs some reform. It's specifically designed to catch people doing something wrong. And I believe the model needs to be to catch people doing something good, building that community policing model even stronger to provide the resources to make a safe society.
Thank you very much. Okay. So I can go back to the other question, which was...
Isn't there one more round? That's what was in the rules that you sent out.
If you would like another round, I, as the moderator, can give you another 30 seconds if you would like to.
Yes.
Do that.
I would. The only thing that I would say is that if we can't even acknowledge that there is some problems, if we can't even acknowledge that Black and brown communities are hurting and looking for us to make reform, then you cannot begin to address that reform. We have to first acknowledge that these problems exist. Not that police officers are bad, not that anyone did anything on purpose, but if we can't acknowledge that communities are protesting because they're hurting, because they want their children to be safe and want to rebuild that trust, then you can't begin to even solve the problem.
Thank you. Would anyone else like a second rebuttal? No? Okay, seeing none. We'll go back to question number 2, which would be, would you support legislation to add more justices to the Supreme Court if elected? And Ms. Hayes, you're first with this question.
Well, I guess I would have to see the legislation, because to deal with that in a hypothetical way, I believe that question probably stems from what's happening right now. And what I do not support is the fact that right now the rules are being changed for different administrations. We have senators who just a few years ago refused to even hear a hearing and now are trying to push a Supreme Court justice through, will not hear COVID legislation, will not come back for anything else, and this is their only priority. So my problem is, if you begin to change the rules for one administration, are you going to follow that through for a different administration? And I don't think that that is helpful. It's actually quite dangerous. But as far as increasing the number of justices, I would have to see the specific legislation or the specific proposal. But right now, I don't think anything is off the table. Because if people are willing to change the rules in the middle of the process, I don't think that that's a system that any of us can operate by.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Sullivan, you're next.
Yes, thank you. You know, FDR tried to pack the court many years ago, and even people in his own party rejected and rebuffed that notion. It's very important that the Supreme Court does not become a mini legislature in and of itself. We want justices who interpret the law, not make the law. With respect to changes right now, it's very disheartening because Joe Biden and the Democrats don't talk about what they're talking about with filibusters, the Electoral College, packing the court. These are questions that on the national level aren't being answered. So I suppose that from their view, everything is on the table. But I would not support packing the court or adding justices.
Thank you. Mr. Walzak?
Yeah, I think it's a shame that the Supreme Court has become so partisan driven. Many people have lost faith in the ability to resolve the constitutional issues for all our people. The process of how appointees have been made over the last 12 years is appalling, to say the least. The integrity of the court is at risk. We need to have a national discussion on the role of the court to begin with. And I would suggest, humbly, that that discussion should be initiated by the court itself, and then at the urging of both branches of the Congress. Remedies such as packing the court are ill-advised. But the House can pass legislation to educate the court on the will of the people. It can also pass legislation to correct many issues that are deemed unconstitutional by the court. As an independent congressman, I can also work to build bridges between both aisles without incurring the wrath of the party. I believe it was also a mistake to eliminate the 60-vote rule for the Supreme Court. We need justices to have more than a bare majority of support by our elected officials. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Hayes, you had a rebuttal?
Yes, I do. I think that using terms like packing the court is actually partisan because the Constitution does not state the number of justices. So if the idea is that the party in power can select a judge based on the Constitution, then to continue to follow the Constitution, you can increase the number of judges. But that's not even the issue here. We are already in an election. The American people have an opportunity to decide. The election isn't 6 months off or even 4 months off. People have already started to vote.
Thank you. Mr. Sullivan, do you have anything to add?
Well, it's very important that when someone's elected to Congress, whether it be the Senate or the House, or you're elected as president, your term is not over right now. It does not matter. And even after the election, they can go forward. Anyone can go forward with a nomination for filling this vacant seat. So, Senator Blumenthal last week said it was unconstitutional. And when challenged on that, he couldn't cite a constitutional authority or violation. On Face the State this weekend, Senator Murphy said it was illegal, and clearly none of that's illegal.
Mr. Walzak, do you have any more you'd like to add?
It simply sounds like a lot of partisan bickering. I think the precedent that the Republicans set during the Obama administration is the same one that ought to be followed now, and the Republicans, I'm sorry, but are the ones that are changing the rules.
And Ms. Hayes. Oh, I'm sorry, we can't hear you.
Having a difference of opinion is not necessarily partisan bickering. This is the space for discourse. As far as Senator Murphy and Senator Blumenthal, this is the wrong debate for that. Neither one of them are here to state their opinion or talk about what they stand for. But I remember, just like Mr. Walzak just said, it was April, I believe, when President Obama selected a justice and the Senate would not even hear hearings. What's good for one administration should be good for every administration.
Sullivan?
Well, that may be true. In that instance, had Merrick Garland been gone through the process, we know right now where Amy Coney Barrett's numbers are. The hearings themselves are almost pro forma, but that being said, had Merrick Garland been gone through, I think that would have been appropriate at the time, but that doesn't preclude another Senate from acting upon the duties and the charges that the American people have given to them.
Okay, we'll go to the third question then. This question was submitted by Audrey Nielsen, who's a student at Western Connecticut State University and also on the news director for the Election Connection. The question is, what policy steps should Congress take to assist students whose education has been interrupted economically or based on health by the coronavirus pandemic? How will you work to represent K through 12 students and young adults entering higher education who have been derailed by this crisis? And Mr. Sullivan, you're first.
Well, thank you. As an educator and someone who's been educating during the COVID pandemic, teaching at Western Connecticut State criminal law, I'll be giving an exam tomorrow night, as a matter of fact, I see a great disparity in the quality of education our students are getting through distance learning. As a father with a third grader and a fifth grader in the new Fairfield school systems, where they're going to school full time. And, we need to have responsible, practical precautions. We need to move forward. I was very encouraged by Governor Lamont wanting to get the schools open. And I'm very concerned. I saw this summer the president of Trinity College talking about the distance learning, but none of these students in these private institutions are getting a discount, even though they don't get to enjoy the full experience that they've been paying for. So we really need to move ahead. And I've been very concerned about the students in our inner cities, those with disabilities, who may get left behind. So we're moving forward, and I really applaud the public school teachers in the 5th Congressional District and throughout the state. I think they're doing a very good job. Just all have to work together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Walzak.
It's a terrible situation, the pandemic, and it's affected every student, parent, and their extended families, both in the elementary and public school system and in the college education. We have a neighbor whose daughter got accepted to a very prestigious school and is doing her first semester at home remotely. She's being cheated by the pandemic from the true spirit of the school. I do believe the colleges are doing everything to deliver the quality of education that they promise those students, and I wouldn't expect to see a lot of tuition reimbursement programs going on. That'll just hurt the system in the long run. I think the federal government on the public school side needs to do more to help the school systems. That's where the biggest burden is falling, and it's falling on local school districts, which often represent less wealthy communities than others, and they don't have the resources to react to continue to provide a quality education to our students.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Hayes.
Thank you. I don't even think you can begin to talk about this question without talking about the safety aspect. Initially, when our students were asked to go back to school and our teachers, I was the first one to talk about, are we addressing the safety needs of our kids? Are we making sure that they have personal protective equipment, hand sanitizer, all of the things that they need? I've actually worked in a school building for over a decade, every day, showing up, where the air quality is bad, where the infrastructure is crumbling. In order to come out of this, we have to first make sure our kids are safe. But then we have to address some of the inequities that have been revealed. Things like the digital divide. We've had kids who were disconnected from broadband, couldn't even get on. We couldn't talk about closing schools until we talked about how kids were going to eat. So we have a food security issue. We have to talk about things like state and local funding. I voted for the HEROES Act to make sure that we weren't laying teachers off. Everybody talks about the trauma that children are facing, but nobody wants to invest in trauma-informed care for kids to make sure that social workers are there. My opponent was critical of me for speaking about these things, but I actually know what it's like to work in a building, to show up every day. I sit on the Committee of Education and Labor, and these are things I fight for every day. And my Republican colleagues think that it is not the federal government's responsibility to invest in education. So starting from that place, there's no way that you can move forward to close some of these gaps that have been revealed. I will work every day. It is my passion. I am an educator serving in Congress. It is the way that I am wired.
Very much. Mr. Sullivan, you have a rebuttal? I'm sorry, we can't hear you.
I thought I hit it, my apologies. The HEROES Act was dead on arrival when it hit the Senate. It was never even considered because, again, this was a Nancy Pelosi bill that was rammed through for $3 trillion. The CARES Act was $2.2 trillion, and this was just more money going out many other places. Even with the CARES Act, Nancy Pelosi had $650 billion of pork going into it. Throwing money at things is not responsible.
Any other comments on this? Yes, go ahead, Ms. Hayes.
I supported both the HEROES Act and the CARES Act because the people in my district needed help. We could not address one thing without addressing the other. People talked about just addressing small businesses. We had a housing crisis. We had a homelessness crisis. We had people who couldn't get access to testing. So for the people who think that that's pork, I can tell you that the people that were calling my office every day begging for assistance in the middle of a global pandemic, if our federal government can't step in now, then what is any of our use as elected officials?
Any other comments, Mr. Sullivan?
Well, it's interesting, Ms. Hayes supported the CARES Act, but she didn't vote for it. She was there, but she didn't vote. And she talked to people in Newtown about that. When you go to Congress, you represent the people, you cast a vote. Throwing in excess of $5 trillion at a problem when there was pork. There were things going out to the National Endowment of the Arts, to the Kennedy Center, to helping out states that were fiscally irresponsible. So it's very important that we do have legislation that works, but it should be directed where we need it.
Zach, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I
Nope.
do.
I'm enjoying the bickering.
Okay. Yes, go ahead, Ms.
I
Hayes.
do. Mr. Sullivan, if you stop telling lies about me, I'll stop telling the truth about you. There was no vote on the CARES Act. They did not call a roll call vote. We were called into session and said, if it gets called to the floor, we need members to vote. So there was no roll call vote. And when we talk about the Kennedy Center, that was set up by the federal government as a memorial to President John F. Kennedy, and it is funded as a line item in our federal budget.
Sullivan, go ahead.
Ms. Hayes, you were the only one of the Connecticut delegation that did not cast a vote or participate when the CARES Act was voted on in the House of Representatives, and that's a fact.
Well, Zach, you have 30 seconds if you would like it. Otherwise, we'll go to the next question.
Next question is fine.
Okay. All right. Question 4 is another question from Audrey Nielsen, as the student at Western Connecticut State University. On what important issue, if any, have you differed with your party consensus or shown your independence? And Mr. Walzak, you're first.
Well, one of the luxuries of being an independent is I don't have a party that's dictating to me party positions. I don't have to step in line with the party organization or incur their wrath or even restricted funding if I don't agree with what one would call the party line. I think that kind of partisan party voting gets in the way of finding and seeking out the best and most likely to succeed solutions to our problems. So I believe that the issue that concerns me the most is the structure of the two-party system and the inability for the other 45% of the U.S. population that are independent or unaffiliated to have their voices heard in the process.
Thank you, Mr. Walzak. Hey, with the same question.
Dave?
Yes.
Well, have a demonstrated record of bipartisanship and working across the aisle with my Republican colleagues. When we first got there during the shutdown, I made it a point to get to know my Republican colleagues, get to know who they were first as people. I've sponsored and co-sponsored bills with my Republican colleagues, and I don't have a problem standing up and being critical even of my friends. Bipartisanship isn't just reaching across the aisle and finding someone you agree with. It's asking really difficult questions of people within your own party. Very early on, I questioned the Speaker of the House on the fact that members were not consulted before important legislation was brought to the floor. Here at home, when schools were talking about open, I questioned the leader of our Connecticut State Party to make sure that teachers and students and families were safe and wanted to have some real answers to these questions. Bipartisanship isn't just finding friends across the aisle and agreeing on things. It's having the courage to disagree when those things happen. Many of the bills that we pass are bills that I support and bills that the people in this district support. Things like reauthorizing the Violence Against Women's Act, the 9/11 Victim Compensation Act, lowering the cost of prescription drugs. Democrats in this House majority have brought forth some really important bills that will improve the lives of people in this community. So I voted on those bills. However, if I have a question, a problem, or something that I take issue with, I have a demonstrated record of not being afraid to speak up. Just this week, I did that about staff and members being tested in the House. I have no problem speaking up to people within my party.
Sullivan? Oh, sorry, Mr. Sullivan, you're still.
Sorry, I'm sorry. I hit it and I keep missing it. I believe the call of the question was, how would you differ from your party? I think it was unfortunate that we removed ourselves from the World Health Organization, even though in December they were saying, along with China, that the COVID-19 was not transferable between human beings, and the numbers coming out of China were faulty. I think we need to stay engaged in the conversation. But that being said, Ms. Hayes has voted with party leadership 100% of the time. She said 2 years ago she would not support Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House. Her first vote was for Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House. Since that time, 100% of the time, she has voted with her party leadership, which is why she couldn't answer the question. It's not about just saying hello to people on the other side of the aisle.
Hayes, do you have a rebuttal?
I do. I guess I would like to inform Mr. Sullivan that I also said I'd vote for Kamala Harris for president, but she's not running anymore for president. Nancy Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy were the only people running. But the question was about how would you differ? And I gave 3 different examples of how I've differed with my party. The bills that you're referencing, call out a specific bill. Don't give percentages. I voted for the Dream and Promise Act, for the Equality Act, to lower the cost of prescription drugs for healthcare, for the environment, for things that people in this district care about. So instead of just giving percentages, pull up a specific bill and I'll defend it.
Yes, Mr. Sullivan?
You know, it's interesting. You don't need to talk about specific bills when it's 100% of the time. Go to ProPublica.com. 100% of the time with Nancy Pelosi. And yes, Kevin McCarthy and Nancy Pelosi were the 2 people running. But just like everyone else, if you're not going to support her as Speaker, you simply vote present, which is what so many people in the House do. Clearly, it wouldn't have mattered because you're on board 100% of the time. If you want to know how Johanna Hayes is voting, just go to nancypelosi.com.
Walzak, would you like to comment?
I have. You know, this issue has to do with the 2-party system. But I'd like to point out that of the over 700 bills that Johanna sponsored or co-sponsored, only 11 of them moved through the extremely partisan Senate and wound up being signed in laws. So frankly, I don't think the residents of Connecticut are paying for our representative to go to Congress to work on bills that never get passed. The 2 houses need to work together, just as the two parties need to work together to get legislation passed and implemented.
Okay, do you have a second rebuttal?
I do. I first want to say that my name is Johanna, but as a first-term congresswoman to have 11 bills move, this is how the system works. Lindsey Graham was just on a few days ago. He has had 3 bills in 25 years. It is very difficult. So for me to have done that in 1 year is quite remarkable. As far as voting present to Nancy Pelosi as Speaker, Nancy Pelosi has done a tremendous job for Speaker. Let's just get that right out of the way. But I didn't go to Congress to play around with my vote, to vote present. We were in the middle of a government shutdown. We needed to reopen government and get our government back up and running. I didn't go there to play games. So I voted for the Speaker of the House so that we can get to business and get working on the job we went to do.
Sullivan?
No, you went to Congress and you made a pledge to the people that elected you at the time. You were the one that represented you wouldn't vote for Nancy Pelosi. No one was twisting your arm. What you did vote for was Medicare for all, which would give 19% of our economy to the federal government to control, which is socialism. What you voted for was the new Green Deal, which ended up with 0 votes in the Senate and is a unilateral approach to a global problem. Dead on arrival. That's the legislation that you've been dealing with.
Mr. Walczak, do you want a second rebuttal?
Well, like I said, everything is dead on arrival when it goes over to the Republican Senate. They don't seem to feel that their social responsibility to the voters is to pass anything.
Okay, we're moving on to the next question, which was submitted by the general public. How do you plan to use your position in office to increase bipartisanship and thereby pass legislation that reflects the people's best interests and not the lobbyists? And Ms. Hager first on this question.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. How do you plan to use your position in office to increase bipartisanship and thereby pass legislation that reflects the people's best interests and not the lobbyists?
Like I've always done, I think by calling people to the table. I've approached this office in a way that it's not just elected officials and leaders that have my ear. I go to the people and talk to people and hear what they want to hear. But even the question about the lobbyists, I think there are lots of lobbyists who meet with representatives and come to my office and they bring forth the issues that whoever they're working for would like for us to know. That does not completely drive my decision making. It informs it and helps me to understand what different industries, but I listen. That's the only way you can do this job, is to listen. There's no way that any one person can know everything about everything. So I listen to people and I hear them and I try to go back to Congress and do the most good for this district. That's the way I've conducted myself in the classroom. That's the way I've conducted myself in the workplace. And that's the way I conduct myself in Congress.
Thank you. Mr. Sullivan, you're next.
Yes, well, as a career federal prosecutor, when I began, I started under a Bush administration for 4 years, and then 8 years of a Clinton administration, and then 8 years of another Bush administration, and then working under the Obama administration for 8 years, and for several years under the Trump administration. As somebody who's worked in government, I always respect the authority of the President of the United States. Whether you agree with that person or not, they're the President of the United States. That is something that I would bring to Washington. And I don't have any lobbyists. I don't have any PAC money. Lobbyists come to offices and look how much PAC money, look how much the lobbyists have paid for Johanna Hayes, that over $1 million. How many fundraisers have there truly been in the state of Connecticut, in the 5th Congressional District? How much of that money has been raised? That's why she's going out and having people right now donate $3, $5, $10, because all of that political action committee money, all the lobbyist money is sitting there with that 1 point whatever million treasure chest. Though that money wasn't raised in Connecticut. I've been working here in Connecticut. I've driven personally to the 41 towns. I've been talking to first selectmen and mayors and representatives that have never seen or heard from Johanna Hayes.
Okay, Mr. Walczak.
Well, clearly bipartisanship is the biggest threat to our democracy right now in Washington. For a freshman Congress person, there are few tools that are as effective as talking across the aisle and talking with co-representatives of both parties. There's a tool in Congress called the caucus that I believe that should be used more often to share ideas with people, Republicans and Democrats and independents, in order to formulate and build support for legislation. I'm not sure that that has been used to its utmost. Johanna, I believe that you are in a couple of caucuses, but that's all. I think they're a particularly useful tool. Lobbyists, I'm afraid, are controlling a lot of the legislation, especially the written legislation in Washington, and it's a case of money buys power.
Okay. Would you like to rebut, Ms. Hayes?
No, actually, I would like to follow up.
Go ahead.
Well, I'm not sure how this has anything to do with the question, but Mr. Sullivan brought up the amount of money I raised. And when I started this, I had no money. I had to reach out in a very grassroots way. His average donation is about $1,000. I've always had grassroots support. So it's not that I'm just now asking for $3. And to that, I would say, it is not my fault that you've had difficulty raising money. You've had other representatives have fundraisers for you, host events. It is not my fault that those were not as successful as maybe you would have liked. I voted for HR 1 to remove money from government. The worst part of my job is raising money, and I can do this without the money.
Thank you. Mr. Sullivan?
Well, 2 years ago, Chris Murphy was very instrumental in helping you raise money, and you're still raising money. I only wish my average donation was $1,000. You know, everyone says the Republican Party is the party of the rich. I can tell you, they are blue-collar people in the state of Connecticut, here in the 5th District, and when you're talking about a $47 contribution, I only wish that were the case, but we've done very well. We raised more money than the last 2 Republican candidates combined, and that's with COVID. So we're very pleased with the money. We're very pleased with our momentum. We have sweat equity in the district.
Mr. Walzak, would you like to speak about fundraising?
Well, I'm in a different league. I've committed to raising less than $1,000 to campaign, so I don't have to spend any of my money out trying to get donations, whether they're $1 or $10,000.
Do you have any more you would like to say on this subject, Ms. Hayes?
I do, because this is a disingenuous conversation. A former Representative Nancy Johnson had a fundraiser for you, just like Chris Murphy had one for me. We are operating by the same rules. When you talk about PAC money, you have more money from Eversource than anyone in this campaign, from an individual. But don't talk about the way people, I'm following all the rules. Let's remove it. I don't want to have to raise money to do this. But the fact that I've figured out how to do it and I'm good at it. I came into this race with no money, zero. I started with $1,000 in my campaign coffers and have multiplied that.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. Go ahead.
I have the support of Nancy Johnson, and I only wish she would have done a fundraiser for me. She was not having any fundraisers for me. She was going to attend one prior to COVID. So with respect to saying that Eversource has given me money, but then you say it's from an individual, I've taken no money from Eversource. So don't mix the two.
Mr. Walzak, do you have any more comments?
I'm fine, thank you.
Okay, we'll move on to the next question. While there is intense focus on the state of racial inequity in America, and rightfully so, what do you believe can or should be done to extend the conversation to include persons with disabilities, who happen to make up 20% of our population? And Mr. Sullivan, you're first on this question.
Thank you. You know, the Americans for Disability Act was passed approximately 30 years ago, and we need to do more. We need to get more people with disabilities in the workforce. I support the IDEAS Act. where right now, for education purposes, you have people with disabilities who are able to get education up until the age of 21. I think that should be extended to the age of 30 under the circumstances. I took an oath 30 years ago to support the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, but that means equal opportunity under the law and equal rights. And those with disabilities need to receive more attention so that they can be a more vital part of our workforce and our community. Thank you.
Well, certainly one of the biggest issues with disabilities and special need children is the school system. Our educational funding mechanism for working with these kids all comes out of local taxes and is a huge burden on communities, especially low income and disadvantaged communities. I think that the federal government has to do far more in distributing funds to allow these children to reach their fullest potential and take economically burdens off of society in the future years when they're able to function. One of my nephews had Down syndrome and got fabulous service in New Jersey, worked all his life and lived till he was 55. We need to maximize the potential of our special and disabled students.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Hayes.
So I spent 14 years working at Southbury Training School with individuals with disability, and you become close to them. They become part of your family. I worked with those families their first concern was making sure their family members had dignity and that they were seen and that the law protected them. On my Committee of Education and Labor, my top priority is fully funding IDEA, because the federal government is supposed to fund it at 40% to make sure that students with disabilities have the care that they need. We voted to expand Medicare and Medicaid. I recently proposed legislation to make sure that all federal buildings were ADA compliant. One of the first pieces of legislation that was passed, one of the bills that you talked about, Mr. Walczak, was the Autism Cares Act, which I have worked really hard to make sure that we are identifying, putting money in fund for research for all of the disabilities that we hear. Making sure that the Affordable Care Act continues to protect people with pre-existing conditions. But I think the important thing is to look at my staff, look at the people I've hired, look at the people that I surround myself with. I make sure that we acknowledge and recognize people from all backgrounds, all diverse backgrounds, different levels of ability, that when I'm out in the community, I'm not just talking to elected officials, but I'm making sure that people feel like they're a part of the conversation. So just look around me at who I surround myself with, and that I'm making sure that those people are a part of the conversation.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to add to this question? Okay, we'll move to the next question. In view of the President and First Lady now testing positive for COVID-19, would you be in favor of a national requirement for masks in public areas and where social distancing cannot be maintained? And I believe Mr. Walczak is first.
Well, no question, Connecticut, like other states, have been hit hard, both statewide and locally. But some communities in Connecticut have been harder than others. We need more guidance based on science from the federal government to assist with state and local governments, education entities. Leaving states to deal with these issues alone will only increase our risk on a national level. Different areas of the country are in different situations. I don't think mandating masks on a national level makes sense. It's a one solution, all answer to a problem. I do believe, however, that states need to look harder at the implementation of mandatory masks where the infection rate is increasing, or certainly over 5%. So I think it's more of a state level issue in terms of mandatory use of masks, but I don't feel the federal government has given nearly enough guidance, especially based on science, as to how to use protective masks and physical distancing.
Thank you. Ms. Hayes?
I would have to say that I agree. I don't think that a national mandate is the way to go because every community is different. But what I do agree that it starts at the top and our leaders need to model by example. We need to make sure that when we're out in public that we are wearing masks, that we are socially distancing and that we are following the guidelines. The CDC should be following the science. This has become so incredibly politicized and we keep seeing spikes. What is happening right now is untenable. Businesses are opening and closing. Schools are opening and closing. We need to get people healthy and safe. All of this, we keep going in circles about the economy, about wearing masks, about all these things. People need to be safe and feel confident that the federal government is putting that first as a priority. We've seen the roller coaster over the last week. I wish the president a speedy recovery. I hope his family and the people around him recover soon. But some of the stunts that we've seen in the last few days really send a message to the American people that seems like this virus is not being taken seriously. That should have happened back in February. Should have happened every day since then. It should be happening now. But doing that from the federal level, the federal government should be making the investment so that states can do the work that they need to do, so that they can make sure that if they're opening businesses, that people have the PPE, that families can shelter in place and lock down, and the federal government will help them until we can reopen safely.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan.
Well, I generally concur. I think it is a state issue, and each state is different. I've watched the hearings that the Senate conducted with individuals from the CDC, and the CDC has been available and ready to offer counsel and guidance to each state as they reach out. And I think that's the important thing. And I think in Connecticut, generally, we've done a very good job of that. People in public places, in close confinement, I think definitely we have to, it's a paramount concern about public safety. Outdoors is a little bit different and people tend to use a little more discretion. That's a difficult thing to legislate or demand, but we really have to get on the other side of this pandemic, and we're learning a lot more about it. And until we have a vaccine, we have to recognize those that are most at risk and those with pre-existing conditions who have compromised immune systems, like my mother who's here at Heritage Village. Those people really need to self-isolate and take even further precautions. And we need to recognize what their needs are and be respectful of them as well.
Okay. Any other comments on this question? I don't see any, so we'll move on to the next question. Families have been affected in so many ways by the pandemic, and it is far from over. What is the federal government's role in helping families get through the COVID crisis, from increased food insecurity to trying to juggle working and job insecurity? Ms. Hayes, you're first on this question.
I think all of our legislation has addressed just what you said. Right now, we have an administration that's trying to cut SNAP benefits in the middle of a pandemic. We need to make sure that food insecurity is not a problem for people right now. As part of the CARES Act, we gave unemployment benefits so that people could stay home and take care of their families or their loved ones until they were well and healthy. The Senate, we have all of this increased scrutiny over our lowest income families. We need to allow people the ability to get well, to get healthy. And the federal government should step in, just like we stepped in for businesses, just like we did corporate bailouts. We need to make sure that families are okay. Right now, we're pushing this down the road with deferring people's rent payments. At the end of that, people are still going to have to pay that money. Payroll tax deferrals for Social Security payments. At the end of that, people are going to have to pay that. The federal government needs to have a short-term strategy to get people healthy and a long-term strategy for our economy to recover. But our first and most important duty should be to protect families and individuals, people. All you hear about is the economy. Yes, we want the economy to do well. Yes, we want to open up and become thriving and robust again. But we cannot do that at the expense of families and disregarding the fact that right now people are hurting.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan.
Yes, well, there's no question that families and people are hurting, but so many businesses are closing that will never reopen again. And that's very troubling because no one will have anything to go back to. So, prior to the pandemic, the country was enjoying a very robust economy, but Connecticut wasn't. We were suffering then, and we're suffering now. So yes, our public safety and health is always our primary concern, but we need to get back on track, and we need to do it perhaps slowly, but businesses are going to make their own determinations, and I think we have to give local businessmen and people that opportunity so they have the opportunity to make a living. And coming back right now with a package from the House where literally you want to bring another $2.2 trillion, which is the very beginning number, and say we've got to give people $600 a week again, is not going to move anybody off this mark. I don't know, and I'd like to hear what that short-term federal solution would be. What we're doing right now is with social distancing, and we know that the median age of the mortality rate or those dying is 75 at this point. So we're learning a lot more about the virus, but we really need to have a balancing of an economy that keeps people alive and healthcare and safety precautions that keep people alive.
Mr. Walczak?
The balance between those issues needs to be focused on both the short-term and the long-term issues that is causing the economy. Right now, our major issue is the safety of the American public. And we're not going to segue into, we are only concerned about senior citizens 75 or older because they're in harm's greatest way, and ignore the impact that it's providing or putting on families, individuals, extended families, and communities. I mean, the federal government needs to get off the bickering between the two parties' positions, not worry so much about what the amount of money is, and get it back into circulation as fast as they can. Johanna made a perfect example on the rent forgiveness. We're simply pushing this down the road and creating a deeper and more serious problem for renters when 5 months of back payments are due plus ongoing. Same with mortgage payments. We need to address these issues now and not pretend that somehow or another it'll disappear in 6 months like we're pretending the COVID virus will disappear.
Paige, you have something you'd like to add?
I do. COVID hit my family, and it hit my family hard. So this idea that we want the economy to open, yes, we do. But I know for sure that just because a business is open, if people don't feel safe, they're not going to go to movie theaters. They're not going to go out to dinner. So the federal government should be stepping in, looking at the unique challenges that our community is facing and acting upon those challenges. I helped to introduce the Child Care as Essential Act because I saw people talking about if schools don't open, how will we care for our children? How will we provide child care? So it's really listening to what the community needs and introducing legislation to close those gaps.
Sullivan?
COVID has certainly hit many families hard. When you're a member of Congress, when you work for a municipality or for the government, your paycheck's still there every 2 weeks. Congress has lagged behind several times, and the Paycheck Protection Program has faltered, and people have suffered. It's not just about going to the movies and going to dinner. There's so many other businesses that are so essential, and people need to have that. Right now, we have so many problems with alcoholism, depression, drug addiction. COVID isn't our only problem.
Walczak, do you have more you would like to add?
No.
Okay. Anyone else?
I do. I'm happy that of for all of the things you just brought up, because even before COVID, I was fighting for all of those things. And yes, as a federal employee, my paycheck didn't stop. But so many people in my family, so many people around me, so many people I care deeply about, theirs stopped. So that's why the federal government needed to step in to make sure that we provided the funding. And had the HEROES Act been passed, families could have been able to shelter in place safely, because all of these things would have been addressed in the short term so that we could get healthy again and get our economy back up and running.
Sullivan?
And in the long term, with over $5 trillion spent irresponsibly, our grandchildren and their grandchildren will be paying for this. But we can always borrow the money from China, something that at the Democrat National Convention, you didn't hear about rioting and you didn't hear about China, but these are also problems that aren't going away.
Balzac, do you have any more you'd like to add?
No, thank you.
Okay, we'll move on to the next question. Regarding the Affordable Care Act, do you support it as it is now, or would you change or replace it? If you would change or replace it, how would you do so? And Mr. Sullivan, you're first.
Well, thank you. You know, the Affordable Care Act, I remember Nancy Pelosi saying, before people read it, you have to pass it to understand it. It's essentially 3 acts in one, and it's over 25,000 pages long. I'm not sure I know who's read it, but the notion that President Obama said that you can keep your doctors and you couldn't, and that everyone of the same age would be paying the same premiums, even though so many people who were healthy were paying for people who weren't. It's a problem, and that's why we really need to fix it. I know that the president was discussing having an executive order if things don't move in Congress, and we need to do that with bipartisan. I mean, we need to hear from both the Democrats and the Republicans, and yes, Mr. Walczak, even independents who are there, and to fix this and make, I believe healthcare is so essential, but we have to have affordable healthcare for people. So we've got a lot of work, but I think the Affordable Care Act in part was a noble effort. And I was very pleased to see that the mandate, though, in 2017 was removed. But we need to work on that together.
Mr. Walczak, your next question.
Well, I don't believe to know what all the solutions are to the Affordable Care Act or to health care for American citizens. What I do know is there's been little action on either side of Congress. The Republican side in the Senate and the Republicans in the House promised to give the American people their version of a health plan that would solve all the problems, and that has not been forthcoming. On the Democratic side, they know that there are issues with the act and there are things that need to be fixed, and they haven't brought those forward in a way that can then move through the legislative process through Congress to get passed. So I believe both parties are at fault in not solving this problem. It's critical that we can provide health care to the American citizens. It's their right. It's not a privilege. And we need to be able to provide quality health care at a reasonable cost. And for those individuals who can't afford it, we need to make sure that they get quality health care also.
Okay, would anyone like to add anything to this question? Mr. Sullivan?
I didn't answer.
That's what I was going to say.
I was going to say that we're in the middle of a global pandemic, and I think the issues in our healthcare system have been revealed now more than ever. I want to do anything I can to make sure that more people have access to healthcare and not less. In regards to the Affordable Care Act, it is not perfect, and I don't think that the first draft, it was passed and then it stalled and we made no changes. Some of the things that I would like to keep are the protection for pre-existing conditions, something that this administration is fighting to strike down right now, despite all of the rhetoric about them trying to protect it. The provision to allow your children to stay on until the age of 26. This year in the House, We repealed the Cadillac tax. I helped to lead the charge. That was one of the provisions of the Affordable Care Act that every labor union talked about. They were afraid of coming, of going into effect. And we repealed that because we knew that it would not work. I think the cost of premiums is something that we have to look at because healthcare not only has to be accessible, but it has to be affordable. We have to lower the cost of prescription drugs. We've had so many hearings about the cost of drugs, and it is astounding what some people pay. But I also think that we have to regulate some of these drug companies. We look back at Purdue and this is why we have the opioid crisis, because all of those regulations were lifted. So we have to have responsible manufacture of prescription drugs and make sure that people not only can access healthcare, but that they can afford it.
Thank you very much. Now for rebuttal, Mr. Sullivan, you had one?
Well, I just wanted to add, as a federal prosecutor, this opioid problem pre-exists this administration and any repeal of any regulations. Chasing the Dragon, which was produced by the FBI and the DEA, I'd gone to schools throughout the district and the state showing that movie about opioids and the problems. We do need to bring, our prescription medications back. We knew, working with DEA, that the Chinese were responsible for producing all of our generic drugs, and they're also responsible for the fentanyl that's plaguing our country. By the way, one thing, the president issued an executive order with respect to pre-existing conditions, so that's not an issue.
Okay, Mr. Sullivan. It's 30 seconds for rebuttals, please. Mr. Walczak, do you have anything you wanted to add, or Ms. Hayes?
I'm fine, thank you.
Something I want to add. I recognize that the opioid crisis does not predate this, that it predates this administration, and not because I watched a movie, because it devastated my community, because it personally devastated my household. So if you think that someone is not invested in making sure that people have access to the support and the resources for addiction, for opioids, for this crisis, and to look at it in a real and authentic way, it's me. I have not spent a lifetime in government, but I've lived these things. I have walked the walk, so I know what families are going through.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Sullivan, you can have 30 seconds only.
Thank you. There's more to it than just, we all know people who have opioid problems. We all know families who have suffered through this. Working with law enforcement, trying to get people educated, the young people especially, is so critical. So it's a shared problem throughout the community. No one has any special license or privilege to what's happened. The community at large is suffering.
Walczak, any comments? Hayes, any more?
No, I guess I'll just wrap up by saying, in regards to healthcare, I think that's what this question was about. I want to make sure that people have access to affordable healthcare. This COVID crisis has really revealed so many cracks, and we need to make sure that we have community health centers, that people can get preventative care, that they don't have, that these chronic illnesses that plague minority communities do not continue. And I am invested in making sure that that happens.
We've had two sets of rebuttals, and we're moving on to the next question now. Question 10 is there a role for the federal government in promoting economic growth in our district? For example, how do you judge the efforts of the federal government in helping small businesses in the 5th district during the pandemic? Would you support changes of any kind? And I believe, yes, Mr. Walczak, you're first.
Well, economic development in Connecticut is critical. We have our dairy and farming groups, and we have our manufacturing, and we have our corporate finance areas. To broad brush the support of the federal government to support those industries is a pretty complicated task. Farmers need assistance and will need assistance. Our manufacturing jobs have lost positions as a result of a world economy. The federal government can do some help there to mitigate it. But one of the real issues that Connecticut has had is the rating of other states using tax incentives to bribe corporations to move. We now see that happening in Connecticut in between towns. I believe that the federal government and the state government should ban economic incentives to get companies to relocate from one state to the other and let them make their decisions on location on much more pragmatic cost decisions.
Thank you. Ms. Hayes, you're next.
Yeah, I think Connecticut has a unique opportunity for economic growth. On my Committee of Education and Labor, I've stressed the fact that college is not for everyone, that we need skills training, that we need apprenticeship, that we need registered apprenticeships to meet the needs of future jobs. But I also think that because our state does such a great job in Connecticut's 5th district, this district in particular, with precision manufacturing, that we need to make this the home for green jobs. There's so much emphasis on the economy and how we move forward in a green and safe way. We can do that in Connecticut. We can refit our factories so that we're making these highly specialized green and energy efficient products right here in Connecticut. What I can do as a federal legislator is to bring money back to the state to do that, to make sure that companies that are invested in those types of things get the grants and the resources that they need, and to make sure that we educate a workforce so that when those jobs open up, we have people to fill those jobs. That's how we revive our communities, because those are the people who will buy homes and will invest in the community and will spend their dollars and will bring their kids to school. And even on my committee, we voted for an infrastructure bill. By improving school infrastructure, those are jobs creators. These are all of these things that are long overdue and we should have been doing a long time ago. But Connecticut can be the blueprint for the nation on things like that.
Thank you. Sullivan.
You know, over the past year and a half, we've lost McKesson Pharmaceutical in Farmington. We've lost Hubble in Bethel and Newtown. We've lost fund zones. You know, our students graduate from college, whether it's here or elsewhere, and there are no jobs to come home to. People say, you know, they don't say I'm going to retire in Connecticut. Everyone's looking to leave. When you talk about jobs, you have to bring people in. It's not about getting federal money to do building of schools. I've had Zoom meetings already with businesses outside the district concerning electric vehicles, not just cars, vehicles, and clean water, clean air. I agree with Ms. Hayes that I think Connecticut is ripe for those type of green jobs, but you have to have a reasonable tax base. 48 out of 50 years, the Democrats have controlled Hartford. We're overtaxed, we're overburdened. When I heard the governor on opening day say marijuana, legalization, tolls, and expanded gaming was the way to go, we don't have a plan right now, but we need to create an environment where businesses want to grow, want to come here, and want to start here. It starts with taxation.
Would anyone like to comment further?
I do. Is it my turn? Can I go?
Yes, go ahead.
Again, I'm a federal legislator. So what I can do from the federal level is to bring resources back to the state. The other thing we can do, if we want to talk about this, the tax base in the state, the thing that does fall in my purview is repealing the salt tax deduction, which over 40% of the people in the state enjoyed as a way to offset some of the expenses that they pay taxes on every year. Regular people, teachers should be able to deduct more than $250 on their income tax, just like the president.
Sullivan, you have something to add?
Yes, what you do in Congress is you keep the Trump tax cuts because the rates for the middle class went down and wages went up. The Fed reported it recently that last year, 2019, Black Americans' wealth went up 35%, Latino Americans went up 65%, and white Americans went up 3%. We need to resume where we were in January of 2020 before this COVID virus. We need to create an environment where you generate revenue.
Walzak, would you like to add anything?
No, thank you.
I would.
Yes, go ahead.
That's just not true. The Cuts and Jobs Act created a $1.5 trillion deficit and went to 3% of the population. The wealthiest people in the country became wealthier. The bottom half and the lower income people have the burden of the tax base in this country. We need a tax structure that is equitable and everybody enjoys it equally.
Mr. Sullivan?
Go to the Wall Street Journal, December 23rd, and you will see that the 10% lowest part of our wage group was receiving the most benefits from the tax cuts. That's simply a fallacy.
Mr. Walczak, am I hearing that you would like to say something or no?
No, I think all you have to do is ask the people. They'll tell you who got the benefits and who didn't. The Wall Street Journal is not exactly one of the publications that I would judge as being nonpartisan in this debate.
Okay. I think we're ready to go to the next question. What changes would you make in the federal income tax structure, if any, and do you believe it should remain as written now? So this is a good follow-up, I think, to what we were just discussing. And Ms. Hayes, you're first.
I think the structure should be equitable. The lowest income earners should not be paying the majority of taxes. I think the wealthy need to pay their fair share of taxes, and we need to shift that structure. We've heard recently that the IRS has said they don't even investigate the wealthiest people. It's just too complicated. So they target middle and lower class individuals. That just doesn't seem fair. I think people have no problem. I have no problem paying my taxes to pay into a system that keeps our roads and bridges updated, that makes sure that our government runs and runs effectively. But under no circumstances should the people who have the least to give, our lowest income earners, should be paying more. So I think that, and we've heard a lot of talk about, the wealthiest people should pay more. I think people should just pay their fair share. I think in this country, we are a capitalist country. People who experience success and have worked hard and do well, that's fine. So be it. But they should pay their fair share of taxes, and the structure has to change. And I've seen it over and over, even in this COVID package. There's all of this increased scrutiny on people collecting an unemployment check. However, they wanted to give cuts to the wealthiest, tax breaks to the wealthiest people that were retroactive, had nothing to do with COVID. We saw companies and families take advantage of this. And again, our lowest income earners are under increased scrutiny and suffering. It has to be equitable. This is the first time in my life that I've only worked one job.
Thank you. Mr. Sullivan.
Well, I can say having 4 W-2s on any given year, teaching at the Yale Law School, University of New Haven, Western Connecticut for the Department of Justice, I can understand what Ms. Hayes is saying. When I look at the fact that Joe Biden wants to raise taxes by $4 trillion, repeal tax cuts that are working for those who are making the least amount of money, the wage earners, and it is documented. And again, you go to the Wall Street Journal on December 23rd, it's well documented that the people at the bottom end were receiving the most benefits. 7 million jobs were created. And 70% of those, 72% of those were filled by women. The lowest unemployment rates for Black Americans, Asian Americans, and Latino Americans. And putting money in people's pockets and keeping the rates down is a good way to go.
Mr. Walczak?
No, everyone's favorite topic, huh? We want less taxes and no cuts in service. The federal government needs to constantly look at how we're allocating resources. Unfortunately, congressional pressures to return dollars to their states, Johanna, and the role of billion-dollar lobbying efforts have made this increasingly difficult. Corporate taxes are the lowest in decades, but it's debatable whether these tax reductions have been put to the best use for our nation and its employees. Stock buybacks, insane corporate salaries, layoffs, reduced benefits to employees have been some of the results. At the same time, tax deductions were heavily slated based on partisan politics, with the wealthier, more popular states impacted disproportionately, such as the cap on the deductions of $10,000. I think we need to reevaluate how we spend tax cuts, because tax cuts are in fact an expenditure. And I don't think that we're getting our return on investments by the tax cuts that we've made to the top 10% of the population into corporate America. And I've worked in both corporate America and my own business, and I can see the impact of some of those taxes. So I think we've got our job ahead of us to really sort it out and figure out how to best use those dollars.
Stacey,
I,
would you like to add?
yes, I will. Again, I'll go back to the fact that our tax structure needs to be more equitably distributed because the lowest income earners are not enjoying all the benefits. And you keep going back to that Wall Street Journal article, but have you talked to any Black people about this topic? Because it is that community does not feel like they've reaped the benefits of that Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It went to corporate CEOs, and that right there is undisputable, that they enjoyed 87% of the benefits went to the top 3%.
Mr. Sullivan, would you like to add something?
Ms. Hayes, I've not only talked to Black people in the district, I've talked to all people in the district. I don't make a distinction. And I can tell you one of the reasons I got into this race in 2019 was because Connecticut wasn't part of that robust economy. We're not seeing it here, and that's just a reality. So it's disingenuous to think that, well, one group alone is suffering. You know, corporate America right now, $5,000 by Lowe's, by Target, for anybody who's adopting. You know, McDonald's is giving tuition breaks for people who are only working 15 hours a week.
Mr. Walzak, do you have any more you'd like to add?
No, thank you.
Hayes?
Just that the only reason I brought up that group specifically is because on 3 different occasions, when you referenced the Wall Street Journal article, you talked about Blacks and Latinos. And I'm saying that those groups of people, if you talk to the people who represent those communities that you pointed out, they will not, they'll tell you that they don't feel the benefit of that Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It has to be equitable. Everybody should pay their share. I think we should all be able to agree on that.
And Mr. Sullivan?
Well, I do agree with that. I think they're 2 separate issues. Paying taxes and getting more money back into people's hands by getting them employed. And we've seen that with 7 million new jobs, 1.2 million new manufacturing jobs, that the Obama administration only projected 2 million jobs going forward and said, yeah, manufacturing is dead on arrival as well. It's never coming back. Gross domestic product went up to almost 3 points, and President Obama said it would never reach 2 again. So there have been great achievements, but not here in Connecticut. So I do agree with you.
Okay, Mr. Walzak, one more opportunity.
No, thank you.
Okay. We've reached the point where I think we need to move into our closing statements. I want to thank the candidates very much for answering the questions from the press and students, the public. And now it's your opportunity to have 2 minutes to share with us your final thoughts. And the person who would be next would be starting with Mr. Sullivan.
Thank you. I'd just like to thank the League of Women Voters again for this opportunity. I left the U.S. Attorney's Office on June 28th, 2019, and 3 hours later began my campaign for Congress. I said at that time it was a campaign against Johanna Hayes, but it was a war against socialism. And I've amended that. It's also a war against Marxism. And I believe that the future of the Republic is at stake in this election. Connecticut was suffering before this pandemic economically, and we need to find a way out of it, and we need a future that's brighter. I believe in the rule of law. I believe in equal protection under the law. I took an oath 30 years ago. I believe in meritocracy, that we give people the opportunities to succeed, even knowing that sometimes they can fail. I look forward to representing you in Congress. You know, Team Sullivan hasn't been through the 41 towns. David X. Sullivan has been to the 41 towns. I put close to 10,000 miles on my car. I've driven myself. I've talked to mayors and first selectmen and people anywhere and everywhere. And they want a congressman that comes back and listens to them. It's not just about your priority, as it is in flyers saying, my priority is to go to Washington and represent you. The priority is to be here in the 41 towns and listen to the people that you represent. Nancy Johnson told me last week that her best ideas came from the people of this district when it came to legislative ideas. I want to be that kind of congressman, the kind of congressman that's here every weekend with you and going down there to represent your issue, your interests. So I want to thank you again. And remember, go to davidxsullivan.com if you want to see where I've been. It's documented. I've been to all these towns, and I'm going to continue being in all these towns up until November 3rd. So thank you again. It's been an honor to serve as just a candidate in this race.
Thank you. Mr. Walzak?
Well, I said at the beginning this evening that I wasn't going to try to convince anyone that my position was the right one or theirs was the wrong. I have heard a fair amount of partisan bickering this evening, but it goes along with a debate and having different positions on issues. I think there's a couple of important issues that weren't touched on, and I would say that I consider climate to be a particularly challenging issue for our nation and the world today, and I certainly would support joining the Paris Peace Accord and allowing the United States to fully participate on an international basis with that. I believe that we can lead the world in technology and create a lot of valuable jobs for our populace. We didn't touch on immigration and the need to come up with a comprehensive immigration plan that provides a route of citizenship for those immigrants that are here and ensures that we have an immigration policy that helps our economy and doesn't take jobs, but does fill the need for the kind of workers that we need. I think I have the skills from my past background of both serving in corporate America and being on the boards of half a dozen local and national charities to understand and relate to the needs of the residents in the state of Connecticut. We've got 40 towns in the 5th district. They're all different, and it takes a different level of understanding and listening to help meet their needs.
Thank you very much. Ms. Hayes?
I'm going to end this debate the way I started my campaign, not fighting against something, but fighting for something. I unify people. I bring people together and build things up. I'm not asking you to choose a side, to choose whether we support the police or the Black community. I'm not trying to scare people by saying, you know, your suburbs are going to be invaded. What I want you to know is that when we talk about healthcare and the economy and schools, the social unrest, about jobs, about immigration, I'm somebody that's going to consider all perspectives, listen to what people have to say, and consider that as part of the conversation. I'm a collaborator. Look at the way I've run my campaign. I've been able to do this without any attacks on people's integrity, their patriotism, their humanity. You know, I have opponents who couldn't even put partisanship aside, tweeted at me over 100 times, but couldn't get the characters to say, get well. That's not what I bring to Washington. I hear you and I see you. And I have been resolute about that, about not going in the mud, about not being partisan. People can disagree, but all of those people need to be valued and they need to be respected. No one who works for my campaign has engaged in that kind of activity, and neither have I. And you know why? That's purposeful. That's intentional. Because after November 3rd, I will be your congressperson too. I will work just as hard for your family as I do for mine. I will work just as hard to make sure that that all voices are at the table. And that's something that I didn't see when I first came into Congress. There were so many communities that hadn't been heard, that hadn't been seen, that did not feel like they were a part of the conversation. So that's what I'm trying to do. Make sure all of those people feel valued and respected, and know that when the doors close, when we are in caucus, the conversations that they're having in their living room, the questions that they're asking, the concerns that they have will be brought into the room by me.
Thank you very much. And thank you to each one of the candidates this evening for sharing their view with the voters. And I now would like to turn it over to Judy Greisman to say some final words. Thank you.
Running for elective office requires much time, energy, and thought. It also reflects commitment to and concern for the larger community. I want to thank the candidates for sharing their views this evening. Thank you again to Western Connecticut State University, the Election Connection team, and everyone else who made this virtual debate possible. Finally, a message from the League of Women Voters. Democracy is not a spectator sport. Be a voter.
A very nice.